The night Harlow figured out that Ronan Vael was going to show up at her door, she was sitting on the bathroom floor with a dish towel pressed against her side and a spreadsheet open on her phone. Not because she was psychic, because she'd made a mistake on Thursday's ledger, one transposed digit, $47,000 in the wrong column, and she hadn't been able to sleep since. She'd been running the correction in her head for 2 days, rehearsing how she'd explain it to him, and she knew, the way you know a storm is coming from the way the air goes still, that he wasn't the kind of man who waited for meetings. He was the kind of man who came to you. So when the knock landed on her door at 11:14 on a Sunday night, 3 slow, deliberate strikes, not a knock so much as a statement, she wasn't surprised. She was annoyed, mostly, because she hadn't had a chance to change out of the clothes she'd been wearing since Friday morning, and because the dish towel was doing almost nothing at this point. She'd slipped 2 days ago. Stupid. Ice on the back steps of the building, the kind that forms in that particular Canadian January way, invisible, honest as a lie. She'd gone down hard on the metal railing and felt something tear along her left side, not a break. Something smaller, meaner, a gash about 4 centimeters long that had bled freely for an hour before she got it more or less under control. She hadn't gone to a clinic. Clinics meant questions. Questions meant paperwork. Paperwork had a way of surfacing in places she'd spent 3 years making sure it wouldn't. The knock came again. Harlow set her phone face down on the tile, pressed her palm flat against the dish towel, and stood up the way her grandmother used to stand up from a hard chair, slowly, without drama, like she was simply deciding to be vertical again. She pulled her shirt down. She walked to the door. She didn't ask who it was. She already knew. Ronan Vael filled the doorframe the way certain men fill rooms. Not with noise or movement, but with the specific gravity of someone who has never once in his adult life been told no and believed it. He was wearing a dark overcoat, no scarf, snow still on his shoulders like he hadn't bothered to brush it off. Behind him, slightly to the left, was a man she didn't recognize. Young, quiet, watching the hallway. Vael looked at her. She looked back. "You didn't answer your phone," he said. "I was busy. For 2 days. I'm a busy person." His eyes moved, just for a fraction of a second, to the way she was holding herself, one hand at her side, slightly off balance. She saw him notice it. She watched him file it away behind those grey eyes without changing his expression at all. "May I come in?" he said. It wasn't a question. She stepped back. The apartment was small. She'd never pretended otherwise, and she didn't start now. One room that was a kitchen and a living room together, a bathroom the size of a generous closet, a bedroom she'd partitioned off with a bookshelf. The kind of place that costs $1,200 a month in Winnipeg in winter, which is its own particular absurdity. She'd been working at the kitchen table. There were papers spread across it, the corrected ledger, a printout of the original, her annotations in red. She'd been up since 4 in the morning going over it. The correction was clean. She'd fixed it. She just hadn't had a way to send it to him that she trusted. Vael stopped at the edge of the table and looked at the papers. He didn't touch them. "Sit down," she said, because it seemed insane to let a man like that stand in the middle of her kitchen indefinitely. Also because she needed to sit down herself and didn't want it to be obvious. He didn't sit. He was still looking at the ledger. "The $47,000, he said. "Transposition error. Thursday, I caught it Friday afternoon and I've had the correction ready since Saturday morning." She pointed at the top sheet. "It's all there." He picked up the correction sheet. "Read it. Set it down. Why didn't you send it?" "Because the usual channel wasn't safe this week." "There was a..." She stopped. Started again. "Someone's been watching the building. I didn't know if your email was clean. I was waiting until I could verify." He looked at her then, really looked at her. She had the uncomfortable feeling of being read, not judged, just read, the way you read a column of figures, looking for the error. "Who's watching the building?" he said. "I don't know yet. 2 men. Same car. Silver Nissan, they move it every 3 hours, but they stay on the block. When did you first notice them?" "Thursday night, 9. Something shifted in his face. Not much. A small recalibration, and you said nothing. I was going to. I was putting it together first." I didn't want to bring you incomplete information." He was quiet for a moment. In that quiet, she felt the dish towel shift against her side and told herself very firmly not to react. Harlow. She hated the way he said her name. Not warmly, not coldly, just exactly, like it was a figure he was reading aloud from a page. "What happened to your side?" She didn't flinch. She'd practiced not flinching. "I fell." "When?" "2 days ago." "Show me." "Absolutely not." He said nothing. She said nothing. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, somewhere down the hall, a neighbor's television was murmuring. "It's handled," she said. "It's not your concern." "Everything that affects my operation is my concern." He said it, without heat. That was the thing about Vael. He never raised his voice, never performed anger. He didn't have to. "You work for me. You are in my building, on my payroll, in possession of information that could dismantle everything I've spent 12 years building. If you are injured, that is relevant to me. I'm not injured. I'm slightly inconvenienced. Show me." She looked at him for a long moment, calculated. Not the odds of winning. She'd already done that math and didn't like the answer. But the cost of losing. And what it would cost her to lift her shirt 3 inches in her own kitchen in front of Ronan Vael on a Sunday night when she hadn't slept in 40 hours. Less, she decided, than the cost of passing out and having him find out that way. She lifted the hem of her shirt. Just enough. She heard him exhale, not sharply. Just a slight release of air that meant he was working to keep his face neutral. The gash had closed mostly on its own. She'd used butterfly strips and duct tape. She was not proud of the duct tape, and pulled the edges together as well as she could. But it had bled more than she'd managed, and there was bruising now spreading in a deep green-purple arc along her left side that hadn't been there on Saturday. "That needs stitches," he said. "It needed stitches Friday. It's fine now." "It is not fine, it is infected." He said it. The way you'd say the quarterly projection is off, matter of fact, slightly impatient, already thinking about the solution. "I've been monitoring it. From the bathroom floor." She pulled her shirt down. "You don't know where I've been monitoring it from. You're favoring your left. You've been sitting on something hard. You have a crease on the back of your right calf from a tile edge." He glanced at her. "I notice things." She stared down, he said, and this time it was him saying it to her. "I'm going to call someone. I don't want Harlow. Just her name again. Nothing else." But there was something different in it this time. Something she couldn't quite categorize. Something that was not a threat and not a kindness and was perhaps a third thing she didn't have a word for yet. "Sit down." She sat. The man he called was named Orin, and he arrived 22 minutes later with a black bag that looked medical and a face that looked like he'd stopped being surprised by anything roughly a decade ago. He was older, 60s maybe, with the kind of steady hands that come from doing difficult things in difficult conditions for a very long time. He looked at her side. He cleaned the wound without commenting on the duct tape, though she saw his jaw do something complicated. He put in 4 stitches, real ones, with something out of the bag that numbed the skin first, and Harlow sat on the kitchen chair and stared at a point on the far wall and did not make a sound. Vael stood by the window the whole time, looking out. She could see the street below reflected faintly in the glass, the snow, the lamplight, the parked cars. She wondered if he'd spotted the silver Nissan. When Orin finished, he pressed a folded piece of paper into her hand. Instructions, she realized, written out in the clear handwriting of a man accustomed to leaving things that could be understood without him, and then looked at Vael and said something with his eyes that she couldn't read. Vael nodded once. Orin left. The apartment was quiet again. Harlow looked at the instructions. Clean the wound twice daily. Keep it dry for 48 hours. If the fever rises above 38.5, call. She folded the paper. "You didn't have to do that," she said. Vael turned from the window. "I know. I would have been fine. Possibly. I've handled worse." He looked at her for a long moment. She had the feeling again of being read, but differently this time. Not like a ledger. Like something harder to categorize. "I know you have," he said, and the way he said it was strange, not dismissive, not pitying, like he'd done his research. Like maybe he knew things about the worst that she'd handled, that she hadn't told him. She thought about all the forms she'd filled out when she came to work for him 3 years ago. The background check she'd assumed was standard. The quiet way his people had looked at her apartment when she moved to this one, walking through the rooms without touching anything, making notes she was never shown. Of course he knew. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. The ledger correction is clean, she said, because it seemed important to get back to something transactional. I know. I looked at it. The original error was mine. I take responsibility for it. I know that too. He picked up his coat from the back of the chair. She hadn't seen him put it there, but he had quietly at some point, and then paused, set the coat down again. Why didn't you go to a clinic? She looked at him. You know why. Tell me anyway. Clinics ask questions. My name surfaces in records. Records get pulled. She said it flatly, without apology. I have 3 years of clean work. I'm not risking it for 4 stitches. That's not the only reason. She was quiet. You don't trust it, he said. Asking for help, I don't have a history that makes that a reasonable thing to trust. He nodded slowly. Not like he was agreeing with her exactly. More like he was acknowledging that she'd said a true thing. You grew up in Portage, he said. She blinked. How do you? I told you. I notice things. He paused, and I read files. She let out a slow breath. There was a specific kind of exposure in being known without having chosen to be known, and she'd spent most of her adult life avoiding it. Standing here in her kitchen at midnight with a man like Ronan Vael, knowing about Portage, knowing, probably, about the foster system, about the 2 years she'd spent sleeping on a cousin's couch, at about the bookkeeping certificate she'd gotten at a college she'd paid for in cash, felt like standing in a room with no walls. Not terrible exactly, just very, very cold. Yes, she said, Portage. He looked at the table, at the corrected ledger. You taught yourself, he said, the accounting, community college. And then yes. Mostly myself, no one showed you. No. He picked up his coat. This time he put it on. She watched him button it, methodically, bottom to top, no rushing, and thought about all the things she didn't know about Ronan Vael. She knew his operation. She knew his numbers. She knew the particular way he structured risk, the pattern of what he offloaded and what he held close. She'd been reading his books for 3 years, and she knew his financial mind the way you know a voice from across a room. The rhythm of it, the logic, the places where it surprised her. But she didn't know Portage. She didn't know what the equivalent was for him. She didn't know what kind of floor he'd sat on before he became the man in the overcoat. She suspected there had been a floor. Men like Vael didn't come from nothing, but sometimes they came from close to it. He walked to the door. He put his hand on the handle. The silver Nissan, he said. I have the plates. Send them through Anders. Tomorrow morning. I was going to. That was already the plan. He glanced back at her. Something crossed his face. So quickly, she almost missed it. Something that might have been, in different light, on a different man, the beginnings of a smile. I know, he said, and then he was gone. She stood in the middle of the kitchen for a while after that. Not thinking exactly. More like letting the room settle back around her, the way rooms do after someone large has left them. She picked up the corrected ledger, put it in the folder. She went to the bathroom, ran the tap, and looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. Her face looked the way it usually looked, like someone who has been awake for 2 days, and is neither complaining about it nor pretending it isn't true. She had ink on her right hand, a habit she'd never broken, and the crease on her calf that Vael had noticed was indeed from the tile edge, which she found privately irritating. She turned off the tap. She went to bed. She didn't expect to sleep, but she did, immediately and completely, the way you do when something you've been bracing against finally passes by. 3 weeks passed. The silver Nissan turned out to belong to a low-level debt collector with unfortunate loyalties and even more unfortunate timing. Vail's people handled it. Harlow was not told the details, which was usual, and she didn't ask, which was also usual. She healed. The stitches came out on day 10, Orin appearing at her door unannounced the way she was beginning to understand Vail's people did things. Quietly, efficiently, with the expectation that she would simply be there and simply allow it. She was, and she did. The scar was small and clean. She barely noticed it after the first week. What she noticed instead was a change in the rhythm of her work. Vael had always communicated through channels. Anders, mostly, a quiet man in his 40s who passed information like he was passing weather reports, tone-free and reliable. Suddenly there were fewer channels. Suddenly there were more direct communications. A message at 6 in the morning, the Vancouver figures need a second read. Your instinct on the Q3 variance was right. A question at 11 at night. The Reiner contract. What's your read on the liability structure? Not formal? Not through Anders, she answered them. She kept her answers precise and useful, the way she kept everything. But she noticed. She was good at noticing things too. She'd just had less occasion to admit it. The second Sunday he came to her door, it was snowing properly. The serious, quiet kind of snow that settles over Winnipeg in February like a conclusion. She was at the table again. Not because of a ledger problem this time, but simply because the table was where she worked and she was, as usual, working. A cup of tea that had gone cold, the radiator clicking in the corner, the knock was the same. 3 strikes. Statement, not question. She let him in. He was alone this time. No one in the hallway. He stood in the kitchen and looked at the table, at the files spread across it, the cup of cold tea, the pen she'd set down when she came to the door, and something passed across his face that she was getting better at reading. It wasn't quite warmth. It was something adjacent to warmth, the way a building that holds heat is not itself warm but keeps you from the cold. I'm interrupting, he said. Yes. He almost smiled. She was certain of it this time. I'll be brief, he said. He sat down across from her. She noticed he'd waited until she sat first, and he set a folder on the table. He didn't open it. He looked at her instead. There are 12 people in my operation who have the kind of access you have, he said. Full ledger access, structural knowledge, the ability to, if they chose, cause significant damage. She waited. Of the 12, he said, 10 are people I've known for a decade or more. 1 is family. He paused. 1 has worked for me for 3 years, and I've spent those 3 years not being certain whether the arrangement is convenient or something else. The radiator clicked. I'm asking, he said, carefully, whether it is something else. She looked at him, at the folder she hadn't touched, at his hands flat on the table. She noticed he didn't fidget, had never once seen him fidget, and she found this strangely reassuring, the steadiness of him. That depends, she said, on what you mean by something else. I mean whether you intend to stay. She thought about Portage, about the cousin's couch, about the bookkeeping certificate paid for in cash, the 2 years of building something in a city where no one knew her name, the specific discipline of making yourself indispensable before you ever let yourself be visible. She thought about the dish towel on the bathroom floor, about the way he'd said I know when she told him she'd handled worse, like it wasn't a tragedy and wasn't nothing, like it was simply a fact about the person she was, and the person she was had been noted. I've been here 3 years, she said. I've had 12 occasions where leaving would have been straightforward. I didn't leave. That's not an answer. It's the truest one I have. He looked at her for a long time. Outside, the snow was coming down in earnest now. She could hear the silence of it the way snow silences a city, muffling everything down to something manageable. I came here tonight, he said, because I had a meeting this afternoon that I cancelled. She waited. It was a meeting with a lawyer, regarding a personal matter. His voice was measured, even. Entirely controlled in the way she'd come to understand was not coldness but discipline, the difference between a man who feels nothing and a man who has learned, at some cost, to feel things quietly. I have been for some months engaged to be married. The arrangement was practical, strategic. It made sense on paper. She said nothing. I cancelled the meeting today, he said. I cancelled the arrangement. The radiator clicked again. I'm not telling you this, he said, because I think it changes your situation or because I expect anything from you. I'm telling you because I've spent 3 years reading your work and I know that you don't trust things that aren't said plainly. So I'm saying it plainly. He picked up the folder. Set it down. A small movement, the only uncertainty she'd ever seen from him. The reason I cancelled it had something to do with Sunday nights. She looked at him. With the particular kind of person, he said. Who sits on a bathroom floor with a dish towel and a spreadsheet and doesn't call anyone? Not because she can't. Because she's spent her whole life learning to manage on her own, and she's very good at it, and she's also, I think, exhausted by it. He paused. And who notices silver Nissans and doesn't send the plates until she's sure the information is complete, and who fixes a $47,000 error over 2 days of no sleep, because she doesn't want to bring me incomplete information. Harlow sat very still. I find that, he said, difficult to walk away from. The snow was quiet outside. The tea was cold. Her hands were flat on the table. She noticed that too, the way she'd unconsciously mirrored him. You could have just sent an email, she said. This time he did smile. It was a small thing, a restrained thing, the kind of smile belonging to a man who has kept most of himself very close for a very long time, and is, perhaps, considering the cost of that. I could have, he said. I came in person. She looked at him across the kitchen table with the folders between them and the snow coming down outside, and thought about trust, which she had always understood as a liability, the thing you extended and had used against you, the thing you withheld to stay safe. She thought about the way she'd let Orin put 4 stitches in her side, because Vael had told her to sit down, and she'd done the math and chosen it. The way she'd been answering his messages at 6 in the morning and 11 at night, not because she was obligated to, but because she didn't want to stop. She thought about the way he'd said I know and meant it. The Reiner contract, she said. He looked at her. Waiting. The liability structure is clean, she said. But there's a clause on page 18 that I'd want a second opinion on before you sign. I flagged it on Tuesday. I was going to send it through Anders. She paused. I could show you now if you want to stay. Something in his face went very quiet, not cold. The opposite of cold. Yes, he said. I want to stay. She got up to warm the tea.